Dr. Sarah Martinez had always believed that healing came in many forms. As she walked through the quiet halls of St. Mary's Hospital at 6 in the morning, her coffee growing cold in her hands, she never imagined that her biggest challenge would come not from a medical emergency, but from a desperate father's plea. The call had come at midnight. Thomas Chun, a wealthy businessman whose empire spanned 3 countries, was on the other end of the line. His voice cracked with desperation as he explained his situation. His son David had been in a coma for 8 months following a severe car accident. The doctors had given up hope, but Thomas refused to accept their verdict. "Dr. Martinez," Thomas had said, his usually commanding voice reduced to a whisper. "I've heard about your work with coma patients. You're the only one who hasn't given up on cases like David's. Please, I'll pay anything. Just give my son a chance." Sarah had agreed to take the case, though she warned Thomas that miracles were rare. She had developed unconventional methods for treating long-term coma patients, combining traditional medicine with experimental therapies that many of her colleagues dismissed. Her success rate was higher than average, but she never promised families what she couldn't deliver. When she first saw David Chun lying in the private room his father had secured for him, Sarah felt the familiar tug of determination that drove her to fight for every patient. David was 28 years old, handsome even in his unconscious state, with thick black hair and strong features that spoke of his mixed Chinese and American heritage. The machines around his bed beeped steadily, the only signs of life in the sterile room. Thomas Chun was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He had built his fortune through real estate and technology investments, but all his money and influence meant nothing when it came to his son's condition. He visited David every day, sitting by his bedside for hours, talking to him about business deals, family memories, and his hopes for the future. He was supposed to take over the company next year, Thomas told Sarah during one of their conversations. "David has everything: intelligence, charm, business sense. He was dating a lovely girl named Jessica, and I thought they might get engaged soon. Now look at him." Sarah learned that David had been driving home from a business dinner when a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact had been devastating. David had suffered severe head trauma, and while the surgeries had saved his life, the damage to his brain had left him in a vegetative state. Jessica had visited regularly at first, but as months passed with no improvement, her visits became less frequent until they stopped altogether. "She couldn't handle it," Thomas said bitterly. "I understand, but it still hurts. David loved her so much." Sarah began her treatment protocol with David immediately. She believed that coma patients could often hear and process information even when they couldn't respond. She talked to David during his therapy sessions, explaining each procedure, sharing stories from her day, and encouraging him to fight his way back to consciousness. "Good morning, David," she would say as she checked his vitals each day. "It's Dr. Martinez. Your father is coming to see you this afternoon, and he's been working on that hotel project you two discussed before your accident. He says the investors are finally on board." She implemented a comprehensive treatment plan that included physical therapy to prevent muscle atrophy, occupational therapy to stimulate neural pathways, and music therapy based on David's favorite songs that his father had provided. She also introduced experimental techniques like transcranial stimulation and sensory integration therapy. Weeks passed with small improvements. David's muscle tone improved, and there were moments when Sarah thought she detected responses to stimuli. His father was encouraged by every tiny sign of progress, no matter how minor. "Did you see that?" Thomas would ask excitedly when David's hand seemed to twitch during therapy. "He squeezed my finger yesterday, I'm sure of it." Sarah remained professionally optimistic while managing Thomas's expectations. She had seen families torture themselves with false hope, and she tried to balance encouragement with realism. But, privately, she was becoming more invested in David's case than she usually allowed herself to be. As months passed, Sarah found herself looking forward to her sessions with David. She would tell him about her day, her frustrations with hospital politics, and her dreams of opening her own rehabilitation center someday. In the quiet of his room, with only the sound of machines and her own voice, she felt a strange sense of peace. "You know, David," she said one afternoon while adjusting his position to prevent bed sores, "your father talks about you constantly. He's so proud of everything you've accomplished. He told me about the charity work you did in college, how you spent your summers building houses for families in need instead of partying like most rich kids. You sound like someone I would have liked to meet under different circumstances. Thomas had indeed shared many stories about his son. David had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, but had insisted on working his way up in the company rather than being handed a position because of his family connections. He spoke 4 languages, played piano, and had a passion for photography that had taken him to remote corners of the world. He's always been independent, Thomas had told Sarah. Sometimes I worried he was too independent. He never wanted anything handed to him. Even this accident happened because he refused to let me send a driver. He said he needed to think during the drive home. The more Sarah learned about David, the more she found herself caring about his recovery not just as a doctor, but on a personal level. She had always kept professional boundaries with her patients, but something about David's situation touched her deeply. Perhaps it was his father's devotion, or the stories of David's character and kindness, but she found herself staying late to monitor his progress and researching new treatment options in her spare time. One evening, after a particularly long day, Sarah was sitting beside David's bed reviewing his charts when she noticed something different. His breathing pattern had changed slightly, becoming more irregular. She watched carefully, not wanting to get her hopes up, but there was definitely something happening. "David?" she said softly, leaning closer to his face. "Can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, his eyelids fluttered. Sarah's heart raced as she called for the nurse and began conducting neurological tests. David's responses were minimal but consistent. After 9 months in a coma, he was finally showing signs of emerging consciousness. The news electrified Thomas. He rushed to the hospital and spent the night beside his son's bed, talking continuously and holding his hand. Sarah had to remind him that recovery would be slow and that David would face significant challenges even if he regained full consciousness. Over the next several days, David's awareness increased gradually. His eyes began to track movement, and he showed responses to voice commands, though he couldn't speak due to the tracheostomy tube that had been helping him breathe. Sarah worked with him patiently, rebuilding his connection to the world one small step at a time. The first time David looked directly at her and seemed to focus on her face, Sarah felt a jolt of connection that went beyond her professional relationship with patients. His eyes were dark brown and intelligent, and despite his weakened condition, she could see the person Thomas had described, strong, determined, and thoughtful. "Welcome back, David," she said softly, and she could have sworn she saw gratitude in his expression. As David's condition improved, the medical team began planning for his transfer to a long-term rehabilitation facility. Thomas wanted the best care money could buy, but he was also terrified of moving his son away from the doctor who had brought him back from the brink. "Dr. Martinez," Thomas said to her one day as they watched David work with a speech therapist, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm crazy." Sarah waited for him to continue, noting the unusual hesitation in a man who was normally direct and confident. "David is going to need months, maybe years of rehabilitation," Thomas continued. "He's going to need someone who understands his case, someone who cares about his recovery as much as his family does. I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I have a proposal that might sound strange, but I believe it could help everyone involved." Sarah felt a growing sense of unease as she waited for Thomas to explain his idea. "I want to offer you a position as David's private physician," he said. "You would oversee all of his care, work with the best specialists in the country, and have unlimited resources to explore any treatment options you think might help. The salary would be 3 times what you're making here, plus full benefits and research funding for your own projects." The offer was generous beyond anything Sarah had ever imagined, but she sensed there was more to Thomas's proposal. "There's something else," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "David's condition has made me think about family, about legacy, about what really matters. Before his accident, I was so focused on business that I didn't prioritize his personal happiness. He's 28 years old, and he should be thinking about marriage and children, about building a life beyond just career success." Sarah began to understand where this conversation was heading, and Her stomach tightened with apprehension. I know this will sound unconventional, Thomas said. But I've watched you with David these past months. You care about him in a way that goes beyond professional duty. You've brought him back to us when everyone else had given up. And you're exactly the kind of woman I always hoped David would find. Intelligent, compassionate, dedicated. The proposal hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah stared at Thomas, trying to process what he was suggesting. Mr. Chun, she said carefully, are you asking me to marry your son? I'm asking you to consider it, Thomas replied. Not now, of course. David needs to recover first, to regain his strength and rebuild his life. But I believe that with the right person beside him, someone who understands his medical needs and truly cares about his well-being, he could have a fuller recovery than anyone imagines possible. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what Thomas was suggesting. The professional opportunity was incredible. She would have resources to pursue research that could help countless patients like David. But the personal implications were staggering. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Of course, Thomas agreed. Take all the time you need. But please consider that sometimes the best relationships grow from mutual respect and shared purpose rather than just romantic attraction. You and David would be partners in every sense. In his recovery, in building a life together, and in creating a family that understands the value of healing and helping others. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She thought about David's progress, about the moment when his eyes had first focused on her face, about the conversation she had shared with his unconscious form during the long months of his coma. She thought about Thomas's offer and the opportunity it represented, both professionally and personally. She also thought about her own life. At 32, she had devoted herself entirely to her career. Her last serious relationship had ended 3 years earlier when her boyfriend complained that she cared more about her patients than about him. In some ways, he had been right. Sarah had always struggled to balance her passionate dedication to healing with the demands of personal relationships. But David was different. Even in his current state, she felt a connection to him that she had never experienced with anyone else. Was it real, or was it just the intensity of the medical situation and her professional investment in his recovery? The next few weeks passed in a blur of medical evaluations and rehabilitation planning. David's speech was returning slowly, though he tired easily and often seemed confused about recent events. His long-term memory was intact, but he had significant gaps around the time of his accident and the months that followed. Sarah found herself spending more time with David as his awareness increased. She helped him understand what had happened to him, explained his current condition, and worked with him on basic cognitive exercises. He was frustrated by his limitations, but determined to recover as much function as possible. Dr. Martinez, he said one afternoon, his voice still hoarse from the tracheostomy. My father tells me you saved my life. He says you never gave up when other doctors said there was no hope. You did the hard work of coming back, Sarah replied. I just provided the medical support. David studied her face with those intelligent dark eyes. He also tells me you've been offered a position to continue as my doctor. Have you decided what you're going to do? Sarah realized that Thomas hadn't shared the full details of his proposal with David. She wondered how much David knew about his father's plans for their future together. Your recovery is my priority right now, she said diplomatically. Week and D6 months after David had awakened from his coma, Sarah finally gave Thomas her answer. She had accepted both the position as David's private physician and his proposal for marriage. The decision had not been easy, but as she spent more time with David during his rehabilitation, she had discovered a man whose intelligence, humor, and determination matched everything his father had told her. The engagement was announced quietly, with Sarah explaining to David that she believed they could build something meaningful together based on their shared experiences and mutual respect. David, still recovering and dependent on her medical expertise, had agreed to the arrangement with a thoughtfulness that both surprised and reassured her. I know this isn't a conventional beginning, David had said during one of their therapy sessions that had evolved into a deeper conversation. But nothing about my life has been conventional since the accident. If we're going to do this, I want us to be honest with each other about our expectations and hopes. Sarah appreciated his directness. They had spent hours talking about their goals, their fears, and their vision for a future together. David was grateful for her care and genuinely attracted to her intelligence and compassion. Sarah found herself drawn to his resilience and the glimpses of the man he was becoming as he recovered from his injuries. The wedding was planned for the following spring, giving David more time to recover and allowing them both to adjust to their new relationship. Thomas was overjoyed and spared no expense in preparing for what he called the beginning of a new chapter for our family. During the months leading up to their wedding, Sarah and David developed a routine that blended medical care with personal bonding. She oversaw his physical therapy, monitored his cognitive recovery, and gradually they began spending time together outside of medical contexts. They took walks in the hospital garden, shared meals, and discovered common interests in books, music, and travel. Sarah was amazed by David's recovery. His determination to regain his strength and abilities was inspiring, and she began to see the successful businessman and adventurous spirit that Thomas had described. David's personality was more complex than she had initially realized. He was serious about his goals, but had a playful sense of humor that emerged as his confidence returned. 3 weeks before their wedding, Sarah received a phone call that would change everything. The caller identified herself as Jessica Wong, David's former girlfriend who had stopped visiting during his coma. "Dr. Martinez?" Jessica's voice was hesitant and nervous. "I hope you don't mind me calling, but I heard about your engagement to David. I need to talk to you about something important." Sarah agreed to meet Jessica at a coffee shop near the hospital. She was curious about the woman who had been such a significant part of David's life before his accident. Thomas had mentioned her only briefly, usually with disappointment about her abandoning David when he needed support most. Jessica turned out to be strikingly beautiful, with long black hair and delicate features that spoke of her Korean heritage. She was impeccably dressed in designer clothes and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting attention. But her eyes showed signs of distress as she sat across from Sarah in the small cafe. "I need to explain why I stopped visiting David," Jessica began without preamble. "Everyone thinks I abandoned him, but it's more complicated than that. I loved David deeply, and I would have stood by him through his recovery if his father had let me." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension as she listened to Jessica's story. According to Jessica, Thomas had approached her privately about 3 months after David's accident and told her that her presence was hindering David's recovery. He had suggested that she was causing David distress even in his unconscious state, and that the best thing she could do for him was to step away. "Mr. Chin told me that David's brain was responding to stress in ways that were preventing healing," Jessica explained, tears forming in her eyes. "He said that if I really loved David, I would give him space to recover. He made it sound like visiting David was actually hurting him." The story troubled Sarah deeply. She knew that Thomas was capable of manipulation when it came to protecting his interests, but she had difficulty believing he would deliberately separate David from someone he loved. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah asked. "Because I've been watching from a distance," Jessica replied. "I've kept track of David's progress through mutual friends. I know about his recovery, and I know about your engagement. But I also know that David never stopped loving me, and I never stopped loving him." Jessica's claim hit Sarah like a physical blow. During all their conversations, David had never mentioned Jessica except in passing when discussing his life before the accident. She had assumed that his feelings for his former girlfriend had faded or been affected by his brain injury. "David doesn't remember much about our relationship because of his head trauma," Jessica continued. "But I remember everything. We were planning to get engaged before his accident. We had looked at rings together, and David had asked my father for permission to marry me. The accident happened the night after our engagement dinner." Sarah felt the foundation of her new life beginning to crack. If Jessica was telling the truth, then David's agreement to marry her was based on incomplete memories and his father's manipulation rather than genuine choice. "I'm not trying to ruin your life," Jessica said, seemingly reading Sarah's thoughts. "But David deserves to know the truth about our relationship and about why I wasn't there during his recovery. He deserves to make his own choice about his future with complete information." The meeting with Jessica left Sarah confused and upset. She had believed that she was building something real with David, but Now she wondered if she was simply filling a void created by his father's interference and his own memory loss. That evening, Sarah confronted Thomas about Jessica's claims. His reaction confirmed her worst fears. Jessica was a distraction, Thomas said dismissively. David was fighting for his life, and she was falling apart every time she visited. She would cry and carry on in ways that couldn't possibly have been helpful. I simply suggested that she give him some space. You told her that her presence was preventing his recovery, Sarah accused. You made her believe that staying away was best for David. Thomas didn't deny the accusation. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. Jessica was young and emotional. She couldn't handle the reality of David's condition. You, on the other hand, have the strength and medical knowledge to help him build a new life. A life based on lies, Sarah said angrily. David doesn't even remember that he was planning to propose to Jessica. How can he make an informed decision about marrying me if he doesn't know the truth? The truth is that Jessica abandoned him when things got difficult, Thomas replied coldly. The truth is that you brought him back from a coma when she was nowhere to be found. The truth is that you can give him a future that she never could. The argument escalated, with Thomas becoming defensive about his actions, and Sarah realizing the extent to which she had been manipulated along with David. She had believed that their relationship was developing naturally, but now she saw that Thomas had orchestrated everything from the beginning. You planned this from the moment you hired me, Sarah said with growing certainty. You weren't just looking for a doctor for David. You were looking for a wife who would be dependent on your approval and grateful for the opportunity. Thomas's silence confirmed her suspicions. She realized that her own emotional investment in David's recovery had been carefully cultivated by a man who understood how to exploit her professional dedication and personal loneliness. The next few days were agonizing for Sarah. She continued David's care while struggling with whether to tell him about Jessica and her conversation with his father. She watched David during their interactions, looking for signs of the feelings he might have lost along with his memories. During one of their walks in the hospital garden, David surprised her by bringing up the topic himself. I've been having dreams, he said quietly. Not exactly dreams, more like fragments of memories that don't quite fit together. There's a woman in them, someone I cared about deeply. I can't see her face clearly, but I remember the feeling of loving her. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that David's memories of Jessica were beginning to return on their own. She knew she had to make a choice between protecting the life she had built with David and giving him the information he needed to make his own decisions. David, she said carefully, there are things about your life before the accident that you might not remember clearly. If you want to know about them, I can help you explore those memories. But you need to know that learning about the past might change how you feel about the present. David looked at her with those intelligent dark eyes that had first captured her attention during his recovery. Are you talking about Jessica? The fact that he remembered Jessica's name shocked Sarah. She realized that his memories were returning more quickly than anyone had anticipated. How much do you remember about her? Sarah asked. Pieces, David replied. I remember being happy with her, making plans. But then, there's this gap where I can't remember what happened to her or why she wasn't here during my recovery. Sarah made her decision. Despite her fears about losing David, she knew that their relationship could only be real if it was based on truth rather than manipulation. Jessica did visit you during your recovery, Sarah said gently. But your father convinced her that her presence was preventing you from healing. She stayed away because she believed it was best for you, not because she stopped caring. David stopped walking and turned to face her completely. My father told her to stay away. He was trying to protect you in his own way, Sarah said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself anymore. But, yes, Jessica wanted to be here. She still cares about you. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. Sarah watched as he processed the information, his face cycling through emotions of hurt, anger, and confusion. And you knew about this? He asked. I only learned about it recently, Sarah said honestly. Jessica contacted me because she felt you deserved to know the truth. David was quiet for a long time, staring at the flowers in the garden while Sarah waited anxiously for his response. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and sad. I need to see her, he said. I need to understand what happened and what I might have lost. Sarah nodded, though the words felt like a knife in her chest. I understand. What do you want to do about our engagement? I don't know, David said honestly. Sarah, I care about you deeply. These months together have meant everything to me. But I can't marry you until I know what my feelings for Jessica might be if she had never been pushed away. The conversation ended with them agreeing to postpone the wedding indefinitely, while David explored his recovered memories and reconnected with Jessica. Sarah knew she was risking everything she had built with David, but she also knew that their relationship could never be genuine if it was based on incomplete information and her father's manipulation. That night, Sarah called Jessica and arranged for her to visit David the next day. As she made the call, she wondered if she was destroying her own happiness or finally giving David the choice he deserved to make. The jealousy that Thomas had warned might take hold was not David's jealousy of other men in Sarah's life, as she had expected. Instead, it was her own jealousy of a love that predated their relationship and might prove stronger than anything she could offer. As she watched David prepare to see Jessica again, Sarah realized that she was about to discover whether the connection she felt with him was real enough to survive the truth about his past. The morning of Jessica's visit, Sarah helped David prepare for what would be an emotionally difficult reunion. His hands trembled slightly as she checked his blood pressure and reviewed his medications, clear signs of the anxiety he was trying to hide. Sarah had never known jealousy could be a living thing, growing stronger with each passing day like a disease in her chest. She watched from her office window as David and Jessica walked together in the hospital garden below, their heads bent close in conversation, their hands almost touching but not quite. It had been 2 weeks since their reunion, and Sarah was learning that sometimes the hardest part of loving someone was watching them remember that they had loved someone else first. The medical side of her brain tried to rationalize what she was witnessing. David's memories were returning more completely each day, triggered by Jessica's presence and their shared history. This was actually a positive development in his recovery, proof that his brain was healing more thoroughly than anyone had dared hope. But the woman in her, the woman who had fallen in love with a man who might never truly be hers, felt like she was slowly drowning. David had been honest with her throughout the process, which somehow made it worse. He included Sarah in his conversations with Jessica, sought her medical opinion about his recovery, and tried to maintain the close relationship they had built during his rehabilitation. But Sarah could see the change in him when Jessica was around. His eyes lit up in a way they never had with her, and his smile carried a warmth that she realized she had never truly inspired. Dr. Martinez, Jessica said one afternoon when she found Sarah reviewing David's charts in his room. David had stepped out for a physical therapy session, leaving the two women alone together for the first time since the coffee shop meeting that had started this painful process. Sarah looked up, noting that Jessica looked different from the perfectly composed woman who had first approached her. Her hair was less styled, her clothes more casual, and there were signs of sleepless nights around her eyes. Apparently, this reunion was taking an emotional toll on her as well. I want you to know that I never intended to hurt you, Jessica continued, sitting down in the chair that Sarah usually occupied when she spent time with David. When I asked to see David, I was thinking about him, not about what it might mean for your relationship with him. Sarah set down the medical chart she had been pretending to read. What has he told you about us? He says he cares about you deeply, Jessica replied. He says you saved his life, and that he respects you more than anyone he's ever known. He also says he's confused about his feelings and doesn't want to hurt either of us. The conversation was surreal. Sarah found herself discussing the man she loved with the woman who might take him away, and both of them were trying to be considerate of the other's feelings while fighting for the same future. What do you want, Jessica? Sarah asked directly. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. I want David to be happy, she said finally. I want him to recover completely and have the best possible life. If that life is with you, I'll accept it and step away again. But I also want him to remember what we had together and to choose based on complete information rather than just gratitude and proximity. Sarah appreciated Jessica's honesty, even as it terrified her. She knew that if David's choice was based solely on the depth of emotional connection, Jessica would win. Their history together, the plans they had made, and The love they had shared before his accident created a foundation that Sarah's relationship with David couldn't match. "He's different now," Sarah said, not sure if she was trying to convince Jessica or herself. "The accident changed him in ways beyond just the memory loss. He's more thoughtful, more appreciative of simple things. The man you loved might not be exactly the same person anymore." "I know," Jessica agreed. "But I'm different too. Going through the experience of thinking I had lost him forever changed my perspective on what matters. I realize now that I should have fought harder to stay by his side instead of listening to his father's demands." The mention of Thomas brought another complication into Sarah's already tangled thoughts. David's father had been notably absent since Sarah had confronted him about his manipulation. He still visited his son regularly, but he avoided being in the same room with Sarah when possible. David had been furious when he learned the full extent of his father's interference, leading to heated arguments that Sarah could hear from down the hospital corridor. "My father thought he was protecting me," David had told Sarah after one particularly difficult confrontation with Thomas. "But he took away my choice and Jessica's choice. He decided what was best for everyone without asking what we wanted." Thomas's reaction to Jessica's return had been predictably negative. He had tried to convince David that Jessica was only interested in him because of his wealth and that she would abandon him again if his recovery became too challenging. But David was no longer the unconscious patient whose life his father could control through medical decisions and financial arrangements. "I'm going to make my own choices from now on," David had declared. "About my recovery, about my relationships, and about my future." Sarah admired David's newfound independence, even as it meant he was choosing to explore feelings for another woman. She had fallen in love with his strength and determination, and now those same qualities were being used to potentially end their relationship. The jealousy Sarah felt was complicated by her genuine concern for David's well-being. As his doctor, she could see that the emotional stress of choosing between two women he cared about was affecting his recovery. His sleep was disrupted, his appetite had decreased, and he was showing signs of anxiety that worried her professionally. "You need to take care of your health," she told him during one of their therapy sessions that had become increasingly strained. "This emotional turmoil isn't good for your brain healing." "I know," David replied, "but I can't just ignore this situation. You and Jessica both deserve to know where you stand with me, and I can't figure that out until I'm honest with myself about what I'm feeling." Sarah found herself in the impossible position of providing medical care to the man she loved while watching him decide whether to choose her or his former girlfriend. She maintained her professional demeanor during his treatments, but privately, she was falling apart. Her colleagues at the hospital began to notice her distraction. Dr. Rodriguez, who had become a friend during her years at St. Mary's, pulled her aside after a particularly difficult day. "Sarah, you look terrible," he said bluntly. "What's going on with you?" Sarah had kept the details of her personal situation private, but she found herself needing to talk to someone who could offer an outside perspective. "I'm engaged to a patient," she said simply. "Or I was engaged. Now he's trying to decide between me and his former girlfriend, and I'm still his doctor, so I get to watch the whole thing play out while pretending to be professionally neutral." Dr. Rodriguez whistled low. "That's complicated. How did you end up engaged to a patient?" Sarah explained the unusual circumstances that had led to her relationship with David, including Thomas's proposal and her acceptance of it. As she told the story, she realized how strange it must sound to someone outside the situation. "So you agreed to marry a man who was in a coma because his father asked you to?" Dr. Rodriguez summarized. "Sarah, that doesn't sound like the rational woman I know." "It wasn't just that," Sarah defended. "I had feelings for David. I felt connected to him even before he woke up. When he recovered, and we got to know each other, I thought we were building something real. But now you're not sure?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think our relationship is real, but I also think it might not be strong enough to compete with a love that existed before his accident. And I think maybe it shouldn't have to compete. If David belongs with Jessica, then trying to hold on to him would be wrong for everyone involved." The wisdom of her own words surprised Sarah. She realized that her jealousy was evolving into something more complex, a mixture of sadness, acceptance, and a genuine desire for David's happiness even if it meant her own heartbreak. That evening, Sarah made a decision that she knew would probably end her engagement, but might give David the clarity he needed. She asked both David and Jessica to meet with her together so they could have an honest conversation about everyone's feelings and expectations. The three of them sat in David's room after visiting hours, with Sarah facing the couple who might or might not be her competition for the future she had planned. "I've been thinking about this situation from every angle," Sarah began, "and I've realized that I've been approaching it wrong. I've been treating this like a competition between Jessica and me, but that's not fair to David or honest about what's really happening here." David and Jessica listened intently as Sarah continued. "David, you suffered a traumatic injury that affected your memory and changed the course of your life. You've been trying to rebuild yourself while also managing relationships with two women who both care about you deeply. That's an impossible burden to carry while you're still recovering." Sarah paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "I think you need time to focus on your recovery without the pressure of choosing between us. I think you need to remember who you were before the accident and figure out who you want to be now, without having to worry about disappointing me or Jessica." "Sarah, what are you saying?" David asked, though his expression suggested he understood her meaning. "I'm saying that I'm withdrawing my engagement and stepping back from our personal relationship," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the pain in her chest. "I'll continue as your doctor until you're ready for independent care, but I won't be competing for your heart anymore." Jessica looked surprised and upset by Sarah's announcement. "Sarah, you don't have to do that. David cares about you too." "I know he does," Sarah replied. "But he loved you first, and that love deserves a chance to be explored without me in the way. If David chooses to be with you after he's had time to recover and remember, then I'll know he made the choice freely. If he decides he wants to build something new with someone else after his recovery, then at least he'll be making that choice from a position of strength rather than gratitude or confusion." David was quiet for a long time, his face cycling through emotions that Sarah couldn't fully read. Finally, he spoke with the thoughtfulness that had become characteristic of his personality since the accident. "You're probably right," he said softly. "I haven't been fair to either of you. I've been trying to hold on to both relationships because I'm afraid of losing the safety and care you've given me, Sarah, and afraid of losing the love and history I had with Jessica. But that's selfish and ultimately harmful to all of us." Sarah felt tears threatening but held them back. "What do you want to do?" "I want to take the time you're offering," David replied. "I want to finish my recovery process, explore my memories with Jessica, and figure out who I am now that I'm not dependent on medical care for survival. Then, I want to make a choice about my future based on what I truly want rather than what I think I owe to anyone." The conversation continued for another hour, with all three of them working out the practical details of this new arrangement. Sarah would continue David's medical care, but step back from their personal relationship. Jessica would spend time with David helping him recover his memories and explore their connection. And David would focus on his rehabilitation without the pressure of maintaining two romantic relationships simultaneously. As they said goodbye that evening, Jessica surprised Sarah by hugging her tightly. "Thank you," Jessica whispered. "You're giving us both a gift by being brave enough to step back. I hope you know how much strength that takes." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to respond. She watched as David and Jessica left together, and, for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace despite her heartbreak. The jealousy that had been consuming her was replaced by something unexpected, pride in her own integrity, and hope that whatever happened next would be based on truth rather than manipulation or competition. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched David's recovery accelerate as the emotional stress of his divided loyalties decreased. His relationship with Jessica deepened as they rediscovered their connection and made new memories together. Sarah continued his medical care with professional detachment, though privately, she grieved the loss of the future she had imagined. Thomas, predictably, was furious about the new arrangement and tried to convince David to reconsider his engagement to Sarah. But David had found his own voice and refused to be manipulated by his father's desires for his life. 3 months after Sarah had stepped back from their personal relationship, David was declared medically independent and no longer needed regular medical supervision. On his last day as her patient, he asked to speak with her privately. "I'll never be able to thank you enough for what you've done for me," he said. "You saved my life, helped me recover my strength, and then gave me the freedom to choose my own future. That's the kind of love that changes a person forever." Sarah smiled sadly. "I hope you'll be happy with Jessica. You two have something special that survived a terrible accident and a lot of interference. That's worth fighting for." "We've decided to take things slowly," David said. "We're both different people than we were before the accident. But we're committed to building something new together based on who we are now rather than just trying to recapture what we had before." As Sarah said goodbye to David for the last time as his doctor, she felt the complex mixture of sadness and satisfaction that came from doing the right thing at great personal cost. She had learned that sometimes love meant letting go, and that jealousy could be transformed into something nobler if you were brave enough to choose generosity over possession. 6 months later, Sarah received an invitation to David and Jessica's wedding. The card included a personal note from David thanking her again for her role in his recovery and inviting her to celebrate their new beginning. Sarah declined the invitation, knowing that attending would be too painful, but she sent a gift and a note wishing them happiness. The experience had changed Sarah's understanding of love and medicine. She realized that healing sometimes required more than medical intervention. It required the courage to make difficult choices and the wisdom to know when helping someone meant stepping away rather than holding on. She continued her work at the hospital with renewed purpose, but she also began exploring opportunities to open her own rehabilitation center where she could help other families navigate the complex emotions and decisions that came with serious medical crises. The idea that Thomas had first planted had evolved into something entirely her own. The jealousy that had once threatened to destroy her had ultimately taught her the difference between loving someone and possessing them. In letting David go, Sarah had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed, and a kind of love that was worth more than any engagement ring or wedding ceremony. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sarah asked, though she knew David needed to take this step regardless of the outcome. "I have to be," David replied. "I can't build a future with anyone until I understand my past." As Jessica entered David's room that afternoon, Sarah watched from the doorway as two people who had once planned to spend their lives together saw each other for the first time in over a year. The recognition in David's eyes was immediate and profound, confirming Sarah's worst fears about the depth of feelings that had survived his injury. Whatever happened next would determine not only David's future, but Sarah's own understanding of love, sacrifice, and the price of building happiness on someone else's loss. Discuss long-term arrangements when you're stronger. But even as she spoke, Sarah knew that her decision was already forming. The opportunity to continue David's care, to pursue her research with unlimited resources, and to explore whatever connection she felt with this remarkable man was too significant to ignore. The question that haunted her was whether she was considering Thomas's proposal for the right reasons, or whether she was being swayed by the financial security and professional advancement it offered. She prided herself on her integrity, and the idea of entering into marriage for anything other than love troubled her deeply. Yet as she watched David struggle with his rehabilitation exercises, saw his determination to overcome every obstacle, and felt the growing bond between them, Sarah began to wonder if perhaps love could grow from the foundation Thomas was proposing. Some of the strongest marriages she knew had begun with friendship and mutual respect rather than passionate romance. The decision would change her life forever, and as David continued to recover and their daily interactions deepened, Sarah knew that time was running out for her to make a choice that would affect all of their futures.